Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John's been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this here podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives. Difference makers who really make a difference.
And today on the Musical Innertube, we thought we'd celebrate Halloween in the best possible fashion, and that is by returning to Cory Hutcheson, who is a folklore expert, and he's going to talk about the fact that witches still exist. He has a book out called New World Witchery, which you can find in your local bookstore. I did. I picked up a copy. It's very interesting, and it's also got a lot of weird stuff in it. And we'll talk to him about the interesting and the weird. How are you, Cory?
I'm fine. I love the weird. The weird is what makes it all worthwhile. So thanks for having me back. Glad to be back here.
You know, John and I revel in the weird.
Yeah, why would I be still together with John? I mean, come on. Yeah. I did like the weird, you know.
I would think that most people would not necessarily be surprised that you contend that we still have witches around. But I don't think it's the witch that everybody, like the witch from The Wizard of Oz, that everybody's thinking of. Witches are quite different in your opinion, right?
Sure, yeah. And it's one of those funny words, right? Like witch can mean different things to different people. So for some people, they hear it and it's, instant sort of scare, right? They're very scared of it. Some people hear it and they're like, yes, give me some of that. I want to be a part of that. So it just kind of goes all over the spectrum for folks. People get this image in their head. Like you said, the Margaret Hamilton one is, I think, sort of a default for a lot of people. But then a lot of people also sort of have this, the sexy 70s witch, from all the, was it the Mario Bava films or whatever, the ones that rise from the grave and have incredible eye makeup and start pursuing the villagers through town.
They always seem like they're ready to go to a party, when they come out of the grave. They think that they're all made up. Their hair is perfect, like in the song. And
they all look like Winona Ryder and Heathers,
Well, they're very well rested, clearly. They've been in the grave for a while. So.
For centuries. But yes, like you said, the eye makeup is beautiful. It's interesting about that, but it's also part of the thing of the undead being somehow weirdly sexual. Speaking of weirdness, there is something about that connection between vampirism and witches and sexuality, which everybody is aware of, but doesn't want to talk about it because it's too icky.
Yeah, I mean, you look at kind of how Halloween is, right? Halloween's supposed to be the celebration of, or not celebration of, but sort of recognition of death and the scary parts of life. And you go to any college Halloween party, and you're going to find somebody dressed as like a sexy turtle, and it's like, how did that happen? But there it is,
Yeah, sexy nurses and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What exactly? Now we think of witches as flying on broomsticks and casting spells. Mm-hmm. Let me back up just a second. Wiccan, is that what they're calling them?
There's a whole. I mean, you've got multiple categories. So people who contemporarily practice witchcraft fall into a lot of different categories. Wiccan is probably the best known of them because it's a religious form of witchcraft practice. Although even then, some Wiccans will say, well, we don't really even call ourselves witches because they're trying to distance themselves from some of the negative meanings of that word. But a lot of them do embrace that and say, yeah, we do magic, which can mean a couple of different things. Sometimes it's just sort of religious rituals or spiritual rituals. Sometimes it is, spells to accomplish things, although there are very specific rules about how they engage with that spell work. And some of it's stuff that people would recognize, from every day, if you're checking your horoscope in the daily paper or something like that, or, power of positive thinking kind of stuff where you're just sort of supposed to concentrate on something to sort of help bring it into fruition or whatever. That, it's kind of a wide range of things that you could sort of attribute there. But Wiccan, absolutely is one of the biggest categories there for sure.
We hear a lot about, practicing Wiccans today. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering how do Wiccans, how are they different from other kinds of witches? What are some of their essential and particular characteristics?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, the religious context of that is really big because it is a religion for those practicing Wicca, and even other forms of what we might call traditional witchcraft or these kind of religious witchcraft practices. They view it as a religion. It's part of the spiritual worldview they have, and for them, they're looking at a connection with what they consider sort of the gods that existed before Christianity. So they'll oftentimes connect with, for example, Norse pantheons, Thor, Odin, Freya, people like that, or they'll connect with Greco-Roman pantheons, or
That's interesting.
yeah. So they're just kind of turning back to stuff that they looked at and they said, oh well, Christianity. We can see that there's been a lot of problems that have been caused by institutional religion over the years. I don't think we can deny that, the Inquisition happened. So
Sure.
they're looking at that and saying, well, we don't really want to be a part of that history. So let's look at the stuff that existed maybe before or around that, and see if we can find value there. Because those people, they tried to live good lives too, by their own moral codes. What can we do with that today? What can we add in? What can we make relevant for us now? And they also see. It's oftentimes very nature-based, very earth-based spirituality. So a lot of people who are very interested in sort of environmentalism see this connection between these, a god of a river and the river itself. And they can sort of see like, oh, well, if I'm paying respects to this river god, I can also clean that river up as a sort of way of engaging with worshiping, celebrating that god. And so they can kind of connect these two areas of their life. And it can be really, really moving and powerful. And that's very different, I think, even though you still have these images of, like we said, the Wizard of Oz, which is kind of floating around out there. There's a sense that they want to differentiate themselves from that image, which is rooted in some, anti-Semitic tropes, and it's rooted in some, negative stereotypes and things like that also have to do with, how people viewed, independent women at certain periods of history too. So the fastest way to get labeled a witch was to not need a man at certain points in history. So
it was a way to suppress, I think, female freedom in a lot of places. The way of the horrible ways of punishing witches was a way of punishing women who live their own lives outside of the village or outside of the social group.
For sure. I mean, even you look at Salem, and I mean, Salem, there's a whole can of worms you can open there, because there aren't people practicing the kind of sort of satanic witchcraft that people are, trying to bring to trial in Salem, and, people get hung for this. But, people are practicing various forms of folk magic and things like that. They're doing divination. They're doing rituals to protect themselves because it's just part of the worldview at the time. But the people who get accused oftentimes involved with sort of land disputes with one another. One woman, Bridget Bishop, she operates a tavern out of her home. So she doesn't need anybody's support because she's sort of supporting herself, and that lines her up as a target pretty quickly. So
let's talk about some of the things that are associated with witches that still kind of permeate the thought nowadays.
Sure.
You were talking earlier about spells. There's spells. There's potions. And again, when I think of potions, there are like stores, craft stores and that sort of thing in my town in Harrisburg, where you go in and they have different herbs and remedies and that sort of thing that kind of bring to mind the fact that, witches, although their potions are made out of bat's eyes and, lizard wings and things like that, but it's still kind of reminiscent of that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's worth remembering that, there is some scholarship. I'm not going to say it's absolute, but there is some good scholarship that says, that sort of like famous, wool of bat and tongue of dog and eye of newt and toe of frog. Those are actually folk names for various herbs that you could find in the area. So, a wool of bat might be mullein leaf, right, which would be used in a certain kind of tincture or brew or something like that you might use to treat something. And Shakespeare just kind of picked up this terminology and said, "Ooh, that sounds nice and spooky. Let's turn it into a witch's potion." Even though it was being used, and people would just say, "Oh, can you give me some bat's wool for for this thing I need for flushing worms out of my system or something like that." It was just kind of renaming these things and giving them kind of a spookier connotation.
A package of bat legs, please.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and you think about, like, it sounds silly now, but like if you went into, I don't know if either of you are like old fashioned candy aficionados or anything like that. I love me some old man candy, I say.
Yes, old man candy.
But they have those licorice drops, right? That are called crows. And you can go and buy these little licorice buttons called crows. And if you went in and said, "Oh, can you give me a package of crows?" and somebody heard that and they had no idea what you're talking about, they would certainly look at you and go like, "Are you a witch? Why are you buying a package of crows?"
Yes.
So,
and what about casting spells? That's always been the big deal about, and tied in also with like voodoo dolls and things like that. What's the thinking behind that?
Sure. I mean, the idea is it kind of comes down to two things, like affecting like, or like infecting like. So you have what's called sympathetic magic, where two things resemble one another. So whatever you do to one thing will happen to the other thing, or contagious magic, which is where you touch something that has magical qualities to something else and the magic sort of spreads. Now that can be used positively or negatively, right? Like you can use it for anything. If you want to have more money, right? Maybe you rub your hands with something green or gold to attract money to you, right? Or you one spell that I've run into in a few different systems involves putting a magnet or a lodestone, which is a natural magnetic stone, at the bottom of a bowl of change, and then you keep adding, whatever pocket change you have to it, and it's supposed to start drawing more money into your life and more money into your household. So it's just this idea of like, oh, you see these things, they're sort of like affecting like. There are types of magic where like you put something down and if somebody walks over it, they pick up the magical effect of that. So if you wanted to leave a curse, you might leave a mixture of graveyard dirt and sulfur and red pepper wherever you knew they were going to walk, and they'd walk over it and then, they're cursed, right? They're going to, have a really bad day that day, right? So that's kind of the two mechanisms that we see operating in magic. There are other things too. There's, summonings where you're interacting with spirits and calling them to you and stuff like that. But the two big ones for spells are really sympathetic and contagious magic. So
a lot of these things that we're talking about here are very old. I mean, they come over on the boat with our earliest as settlers, right? And I'm talking about the European strain of magic. And I'm wondering, does our present soup of traditions, is there any Aboriginal magic, any Indigenous American magic in that?
Sure, absolutely. There's a lot of Native American influences on various practices that have evolved in North America. So for example, there's a practice called hoodoo, which people mistake for voodoo. Voodoo is actually a religion that comes from Haiti, and even then comes back from sort of West African practices and things like that. I mean, it's very, very much misunderstood actually, but hoodoo is a magical practice that was practiced by largely African American people who were enslaved at the time, and even kind of after slavery, were still continuing to practice this system. And a lot of what would happen is they were trying to adapt the things that they had, learned to practice in kind of their African culture before they were enslaved and brought over to North America. But once you get here, the stuff that you have available is just totally different, right? Like, if you have an herb or a plant that you're used to using in West Africa, there's no easy approximation of that here in North America. But what they found was the people who really knew all of that stuff were Indigenous Americans. And so there would be these connections made between enslaved peoples and sort of the Indigenous peoples of the area who would then sort of teach them like, oh, well, this plant is good for that. And this plant is good for that. And, this stone can do this thing. And so that starts to get picked up by people practicing hoodoo. And we even see that up in Pennsylvania, where we have sort of Pennsylvania German settlers. The Pennsylvania Germans had, I'm not going to say like excellent relations with Native Americans. There were certainly conflicts, but William Penn did try to, to honor some of those treaties and try to interact positively with indigenous peoples, the Susquehannocks in the area, and so there was some interaction right between the Pennsylvania German settlers and the Pennsylvanians in the area, sharing information, even to the point where one of the healing systems found in the sort of central Pennsylvania area. It's in Pennsylvania German, it's called Braucherei, which just means trying or trying to heal. But a nickname for it is powwow. And we're not 100% sure why it's called that. It could be a derivation from the word power, but it could also be something that they've picked up from Algonquin language as well. So there could be some lingering connections there. And again, the herbal plant-based stuff is also getting picked up as they sort of adapt to this new landscape.
So it's a melting pot like so much else about America is, you know.
When I was talking to you about this program with another person recently, he said, "Oh yeah, my sister says she's a witch." Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is this sort of a thing now? I mean, obviously there are not covens of witches that meet in the in the woods at night, or maybe there are.
There probably are, quite frankly.
Well, this is a sort of a thing though, where people can consider themselves, or women or men, I guess, can consider themselves witches or involved in this sort of thing. And I don't want to say it's a cult, but is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, a cult just means, any group of people sort of collected around an ideology. There can be, for a lot of people, they look at Christianity and say, well, that's sort of a cult as well, or it was a cult when it first started, obviously. The Romans certainly viewed it that way, right? But what we look at today, the people who are practicing this, it's an empowering thing, right? It's a sort of reclaiming something that has been that's been bad, right? So you see a lot of people who are coming from backgrounds where they have been hurt religiously or treated badly by their sort of home religion. They'll look for this because it says, no, you can have power and you can make choices for yourself. And you can make these decisions. You can do the spell work yourself. You don't need a priest or an intermediary, right, to do all this stuff. Or you'll have people who, may not have religious trauma necessarily in their background, but they do see it as a sort of like a way to say that they are powerful, or that, I want to go out and make a difference in the world, whether that is, physically doing, physical things for my community, or whether that is spiritually and through this sort of magical work. So people are reclaiming this. And it's huge. It's at one point it was labeled by Pew Research as one of the fastest growing religions in America. It's been surpassed by the nuns lately, not the ones wearing the penguin outfits, but the people who profess no belief. But it's still a very big religion. And there's, I think the estimate's like 1 to 2 million potentially in North America. Then, which is, it's not huge. It's a very small percentage of the population, but it's a significant one. And you do have, it gets a lot of attention. We have Wiccan characters that show up on television shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's even a Scooby-Doo movie that had Wiccans in it. So this, it has some traction in the culture, even while it is also still, it still kind of gets maligned too because of the sort of satanic panic mindset of the 1980s and 1990s that sort of lingers, I think, for a lot of people. And they say, "Oh, are these the people that are playing the scary Dungeons and Dragons? And they're going to go out and sacrifice their children?" And no, they're not. They're absolutely not going to go do that. But they're much more likely to be, going out and planting trees than they are to be, trying to lure children into a cauldron. So.
More Witchery with Cory in a moment, but first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Cory Thomas Hutcheson is a folklorist and university lecturer at Middle Tennessee State University. He has a doctorate in American Studies with specializations in folklore, religion, and ethnicity from Penn State.
Cory is the author of the book New World Witchery, a trove of American folk magic. And he's the co-host of a podcast of the same name, New World Witchery, along with 2 other podcasts, Chasing Foxfire and Myth Taken, a Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast.
Cory has contributed to the books Oxford Handbook of American Folklore and Folklife Studies and American Myths, Legends, and Tall Tales.
And now, back to the spooktacular musical Innertube.
Ooh.
As John mentioned earlier, a lot of this stuff comes from the old country, whether the old country is someplace in Europe or someplace in Africa. And it deals with superstition. It deals with with habit. I'm thinking of, I spilled salt, I'm going to throw some over my shoulder. Never walk under a ladder. All those things combined with, old wives' tales, that come from your grandmother and that sort of thing. Is that all woven in to this whole pattern of magic sort of lying underneath the surface?
For sure. Yeah. Superstition and folk belief are fundamental to a lot of practices. Now, there are certainly folks that are going to come back and say, they're trying to be rational, or they're looking at sort of the science of this and all that. But I would say a huge amount of this is very much rooted in these kind of old folk beliefs and folk understandings. And superstition, it's kind of a dirty word for folks, but the way I like to kind of talk about it is, we get what the word understanding means, right? Understanding means that you grasp something, you grok it from start to finish. You really understand the rational process by which something happens, right? You understand if you want to clean your clothes, you got to put them in the washing machine, add the soap, turn it on, all that kind of stuff, right? Superstition comes from Latin words that basically mean overstanding, standing over something. And the idea is that you see that two things are connected, but you don't actually understand all the stuff between them, right? You see that if I do this one thing, this other thing happens. There's no rational reason for it to happen. No rational reason why if I spill salt and throw it over my shoulder, I'm prevented from having bad luck. But I see that if I do it, it has an effect. And so it's really observational stuff. Like, this is people have been observing this stuff. And sometimes we find later on down the line, for example, foxglove is a really good example. People were using foxglove as a folk remedy for when you had weak hearts and things like that. And they didn't necessarily understand the medicinal aspects of this. Well, it turns out it has a chemical in it that if you have too much of it, it'll give you a heart attack. But if you already have heart conditions, they actually even still use it as a prescription medication, digitalis, as a way to regulate your heart so that you don't have a heart attack. So it's one of those things where sometimes it's old understanding that just hasn't been proven yet. Sometimes it's just a sense that there's a connection between these things. And people are sort of adopting that and saying, like, well, we don't need to rationally understand everything. We can accept that there's mystery and wonder kind of under this stuff. And, witches are mysterious and wonderful and weird and magical. So it all kind of ties together.
Magic connects us with the world as it is. A lot of magic has been, willow bark, for example, which the Indians found out if you chewed it could help make a toothache better. And if you boiled it in water, you could drink it and alleviate pain. And now we have aspirin, right? And salicylic acid for that reason. So that magic is also a way of paying attention and finding out the potential for surprising connections and surprising things that nature can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people really watched modern day witches practicing what they were doing, they would be incredibly bored. It's really boring because it's a lot of like watching the signs, watching birds fly. How many birds are over there? Okay, let's pay attention to that. Okay, let's pay to, the color of these leaves. And it's like constant note taking. So, that's one of those things people see that and they're like, it's not the Harry Potter flashbang, waving a wand and sparks go flying kind of stuff. It is very much slow, very subtle kind of stuff where you do a ritual, but it is, mostly you kind of observing the world around you and trying to manipulate it or interact with it in these kind of very subtle ways.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, nothing like Bewitched, where a girl goes and tweaks her nose and things appear or disappear.
No, I've tried it so many times; it doesn't work.
Right. It was such a cute nose too. Maybe it's just hers that worked.
Just Elizabeth Montgomery, only
exactly.
her.
Oh my God! Yes.
She twitches her nose at me. I do something.
Wouldn't you? Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
Let me go to a couple of things specifically that you bring up in the book, The New World Witchery, which is available at bookstores everywhere. Something that John and I know about from our music backgrounds, and that is that if you go to the crossroads, you're going to meet the devil, and he's going to make you the best guitar player in the whole universe.
Oh yeah.
How did that come about, and why are crossroads important in literature and in folklore?
Sure. I've got to ask, have either of you ever been tempted to do that?
Well, I don't play
there.
John.
I've been there, and instead of being made the best guitarist in the world, somebody with a pointy tail and horns asked me for a 20. It was completely new what I expected. It's like the Grateful Dead song, I'm a friend of the devil. I just didn't know it.
Yeah. There you go. I love that. Yeah. No, that's great. It's a fun legend. It gets associated with Robert Johnson, although it may also be tied to another bluesman named Tommy Johnson. Both were active kind of in the Memphis area, in the sort of northern Mississippi area. So, but Robert Johnson is the one who's really associated with this legend because he has a song called Me and the Devil and a song called Crossroads Blues. And so people kind of connect all those things together. But Crossroads have been a place where magic, particularly kind of weird, interesting, sometimes dark magic happens. The scary magic happens for a long time. Some of that comes down to there's stories about the idea that that's where you'd hang your criminals, and so criminals are hung at the crossroads, so it's a place between life and death and stuff like that. But it doesn't seem to be directly that. It seems really to be about the fact that it is an intersection of two things. And whenever you have two things intersecting, like the sea and the shore, right? There's a space there that isn't quite sea and it isn't quite shore, right? It's not quite land. It's not quite water, right? And the crossroads are at that intersection, right? So anytime you have intersections, we call that a liminal space, a space between two other places. And that's a really strong place for magic because normal rules no longer apply in a liminal space. You're always, having to abide by just sort of the rules of the in-between world, right? Or as they would say in Stranger Things, it's the upside down, right? The upside down world.
Yeah, right.
And so because of that, everything that you do at these crossroads can have a magical significance. Well, one of the creatures that you could potentially meet at the crossroads, and the crossroads, we mentioned voodoo earlier. In voodoo religion, there are spirits that dwell at crossroads that you go and you leave offerings from there, but they're really kind of like children. You leave them candy and things like that. So they're not menacing or dangerous. But one of these spirits that does show up, especially in European lore, is the devil. And I should say, European lore about the devil is really funny because sometimes they're talking about these sort of, the Christian sort of satanic devil. And sometimes they seem to be talking about this kind of like mischievous wood spirit that comes out of, Germanic lore and things like that, which is much closer to kind of how we envision, the pointy horned goat hooved devil. That's much more in line with the sort of Germanic spirit thing than anything we see described sort of biblically. Where he's either sort of described as sort of human-like or as a giant dragon, depending on where you're looking. Right. So this kind of weird goat-footed creature that shows up at the crossroads, he'll make deals with you. He can give you things. He can, if you need money, he can find you money. Yeah. You need to get somebody to fall in love with you. Yeah, he's got something for that, but it's going to cost you something. And in some stories, it's you pay a penalty or you pay a price. You bring him an offering, and he'll give you this thing. And in some cases, it's we get the lore about you sell your soul to the devil, right? I don't know what he's going to do with it. I don't know what he's I don't know what it's worth. Why is he collecting all these souls? But it's not going to do much. At least mine's not. I'm not getting much use out of mine these days anyway. So.
The groups that practice the kind of magic you're talking about, I mean, they're also part of sort of that longing, to be part of a meaningful group of people who see the world in the same way and have the same relationship to it. And yes, let's put magic on top of it and also have superpowers. But it's not always,
I mean, who wouldn't want that, right?
Right.
And your point there about that is also that when you put magic on top of it, you start to see nature as magical. You start to see nature as full of wonder. And if you think about kind of the relationship we've had, especially over the last 150 years, to nature, where we've been, industrial revolution, it's very much sort of transforming nature into a raw material or a resource to be exploited, right?
Yeah.
And so this vision, this vision of an enchanted world, which could, an enchantment doesn't have to just be like all, sparkles and rainbows. It can be the scary, talking wolf that lives in the dark of the woods and wants to, devour you or something like that. But to see that world, to see the natural world around you as having the potential to be enchanted again, I think that's a big appeal for a lot of people, for sure.
And one of the things that's charming and encouraging about magic, however one defines it, is that it can reveal existence to be surprising and affirmative and wondrous, right? Just on its own terms. Whether things are miracles or not, there's a lot of stuff that seems pretty dang miraculous.
Oh no! I mean, yeah, you look at the computers that got us to the moon would fill a room and didn't have the computing power of like the iPhone in our pocket. That is wondrous. So for sure.
Seriously, and how much of what you would call magic is actually science? You were talking earlier about the remedies where people would use foxglove, and it actually contains a chemical that is useful in treating diseases. So how much of medicine, how much of science is actually just folklore becoming discovered by, people who dig into it and find the actual physical realities of it?
And I don't want to overstate that either, because I mean, there's definitely a lot of stuff that is, that there's a lot of old wives' tales things that I would not recommend that you go out into, because they will kill you eventually. There are certain things you should definitely not be eating that are not good for you. Like there was there's a mountain remedy that was used for a long time called sheep's tea, that basically was you would go out and collect the dung of the sheep, and you'd brew it into a tea and you drink it as a sort of spring tonic to flush your system. And I'm just going to say, I'm not recommending that to anyone. It's not approved. But it's interesting, right? And yeah, and we do have this sense of like, people are just trying to deal with their problems. In an era where doctors are not readily available, of course you're going to try to find remedies that work for you. And people who don't understand how those remedies work might label them as magic. And then you get somebody who looks at that and says, well, you're doing magic. We can't have that, right? This really is something that you should be turning to a religious authority for, or some secular authority that this religious authority approves of in some cases, perhaps. But so yeah, there's definitely some connection between sort of learning this, like I said, it's observational, right? You're observing patterns in nature as a way of sort of understanding what's going on in the world around you. That's a lot of how natural science starts too. It's just kind of, you go in different directions. One of them is very sort of mysticism driven, and one is very rationally driven and trying to, understand the mechanisms. And so, they're at least coming from similar desires. They just kind of have different directions and different outcomes.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk about different, you take us through the house basically and say, here's some magical stuff that's in your pantry, things that are used in cooking that are magical. You even say that some of the cleaning agents, there's a thing you have in there on pine sol, as being sort of tied to magic. How is pine sol tied to magic?
Sure. Well, one, so a lot of the people who were working on these kind of, so turpentine was a very necessary agent for a lot of different applications. You need it for everything from, painting to being able to do industrial cleaning and things like that. So turpentine, which is derived from pine trees, had to be farmed. And so you had a lot of people doing these turpentine farms down in sort of the Gulf Coastal South. The people who were working on these farms were oftentimes African-American people who were either under slavery at one point in time, or had sort of been turned into sharecroppers, or, were being employed, but, I'm not going to say there were fair wages involved, but they were certainly, being, put to work on these turpentine farms. Well, African-American people developed these cleaning formulas based on this turpentine, this pine resin that they're creating. One, it smelled good. If you didn't use the actual turpentine, but you just used the pine resin itself, it smelled really good. And two, you knew that it cleared stuff away, right? You knew that it got rid of bad things around you. There were some historical, connections in indigenous medicine that had to do with pine, doing pine needle tea or pine needle solutions that could clean things too. There's some European lore about that. So it all kind of coalesced. And you have these people, there's one fella, I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head. I think it's Millard something or other. But he saw some of these formulas that were being used in African-American households. And he said, well, why don't we just bottle that and sell that? Because it's a good, effective cleaner, and people are buying it anyway. But he didn't realize that I think a lot of people were actually using this because you weren't just cleaning away the dirt. You were also trying to clean away any kind of, bad spirits that were in the household. You were trying to get rid of any bad luck that was in the household, because it wasn't just soap and water, right? You weren't just using soap and water. This pine very specifically was being used to strip away negative, I don't want to say negative energy because that's not how they would have framed it, but bad luck is a good way to think of it. So they're trying to strip away all that bad luck and kick it out of the house, right? And yeah, Pine Sol, it's, you pick up a bottle of Pine Sol off your shelf, you don't necessarily know that that's in there, but there's this whole history in it, right? And so much of it also is, when we think about magic is not, we have these images of witches and magicians and things like that. And sometimes we imagine the sort of the wizard in his high tower, or the Gandalf, right? And that seems very elite. But magic mostly was done historically by people who didn't have very much. They didn't have all that much stuff to rely on, so they had to make do with what was around them. So they found ways to turn, the ingredients you'd pick up at the supermarket into magic. They found ways to pick up stuff that was just growing in the dirt out back of your house.
Right.
They turned that into magic. So it really is kind of the practice of people who were coming from poverty or coming from oppression, and just trying to reclaim some of that power in their lives. So
when we look at the fact that Halloween comes up and entertainment always grabs Halloween by the throat, is there any positivity or any reality connected to Hocus Pocus 1 or 2?
Well, so I have to say I haven't seen the second one yet. I've heard it's very good. I've heard it's a very good, sequel. I think I was just the wrong age for the first one when it came out, so I never really thought much of it. There is the whole, the Sanderson sisters, I think, are in Salem. So there's a whole, Salem witch thing that you could kind of go into and say, were the people practicing witchcraft in Salem? Again, not quite the way that we would think of it, but they were certainly doing folk magic. And I think there's a candle that they light.
Yes, candles are a black flame candle.
Yeah,
and I only know that because I watched it with my granddaughter again 2 days ago.
Is it good? I hear it's good.
Well, yeah, it's fun, and it's got Bette Midler singing in it. So
Sure. Well, there's your magic. If you're looking for your magic, it's Bette Midler singing. So for sure. Yeah, candles do show up in magic. We do see it's because you're transforming something, anything where you're doing something like burning a candle and it's slowly melting away, but it's giving off light. That's sort of a magical process. So yeah, certainly there's stuff like that you could point to. But I wouldn't rely on it for a reliable picture of what modern witchcraft looks like either. So.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Hey, Cory, thanks very much for being with us again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me back on. Yeah, this is a lot of fun.
And all the best with your book as well. It just is a wonderful read. You can open it almost anywhere and learn things you didn't know.
Thanks. Well, that's the goal, right? That's why it's so big. that makes it a doorstop if you need something to hold your door up.
I was wondering about the bigness. Was this a monument opus for you? Was this many years in the making?
Yeah, no. This took about 3 years to put together. There was a photo when I finished it of the stack of books that I had used, and I had literally built a book fort around myself. Imagine a pillow fort, but it's all books from the research. So.
Well, it certainly worked out, and it is, like John says, it is a great read, and we would heartily recommend people go and pick it up at the store because there's a surprise on every page when you're talking about just everyday things that we run into that wind up being connected in some way or another to magic and witchcraft.
Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful and happy Halloween.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Check out our website at musicalinnertube.com, where you'll find all our episodes, profiles of our guests, and lots of extras. You'll even be able to leave us a voicemail.
Our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. On Twitter, our handle is MInnertube. Capitalize the M and I.
The Innertube is available on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iHeartRadio podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.